We're going to do our final session, which is a conversation between Stefania Milan, Eugenia Sevapera, myself, Cristina Fleischer-Pominaya, Emilia Anontrere, and Edmund Cheng. So thanks very much, all of you, for being here with me. And this is just going to be a conversation between us about some of the bigger issues that we've been talking about. And we hope that you enjoy it and find it stimulating. So I'm going to start us off talking about algorithms. And the question that I'm posing to all of you is, why should those of us who care about democracy and social movements care about algorithms?
Well, that's a big question, but also a great question, I would say. And I would just stick with Ammonia's question. I mean, his remark that it's algorithm who finds us, right? I mean, in a way that in the modern digital world, a lot of our worldview and preferences somehow, we believe it's spontaneous, is something that deep down in our belief or whatsoever. But sometimes, and more often than, it's because of algorithm, right? And I think that is really why that really matters. But I think in a way, what we have been discussed over time is, but then those algorithms also shape a lot of different communities, different beliefs, and become increasingly fragmented. People, I mean, there are some sort of keywords that have been ongoing in different talks: fragmentations, political polarizations, and those are really important issues. Yeah, and Ciara would like to add?
No, thanks. Thanks, Evan. Answer would be that they matter because they are so pervasive of our society that they cannot, I mean, they're mundane, they are everywhere. Not just in politics, as I try to show in health-related issues, school education, warfare, everything is algorithmically structured in some way or the other to a certain extent, and it's not getting, and it's now getting more and more. I mean, it's something that is increasing by the day. So I will say it matters because it is already a reality that we have to deal with, that is so profoundly changing, shaping many of the things that we do in our everyday lives, including voting, having an opinion about something especially, or not having an opinion about something that is inevitable and impossible not to take them into account. That was just my point.
So what about, though, algorithms specifically for the implications for democracy and for social movements in particular?
On the specific example of algorithms structuring platforms, because platforms are, by platforms I mean the main social media platforms, because they're the main kind of infrastructure now for the public sphere. They're the main kind of like outlets where people meet and discuss, and algorithms structure this experience. They close off certain possibilities and they open up or steer users or steer citizens towards directions, and then they are not accountable. And this is a political issue. And this is directly affects how democracies operate.
Yeah, and to add to that, because we've already heard a lot, but then we can also touch upon the issue of governance of the society as we know it, democratic relationship and decision making. So I like to think about, the role of algorithms in what I call the governance by data infrastructure, whereby basically you implement algorithmic decision making or monitoring at various levels of the institution of the democratic society. And you can name a number. I mean, Emilian already mentioned too, for example, healthcare or decision when it comes to, job market and education, and you name it. So, yeah, the implications for democracy are really at so they sort of affect every level of the stack, to use terminology, which is, comes from computing, if you want.
And staying with you, Stefania, what new stakes do algorithms pose for digital activism specifically?
Well, that's another very broad, very interesting question. New stakes. Well, there's let me maybe talk about the possibilities actually there. So to answer your question from another angle, which is the methodological one. So algorithms are are filtering in a way what we see as mediating what we see or we know as digital activism, but in turn they're also part of the solution, if you want, not the solution to any particular social problem, but the solution to some scholarly problem that we might have. So we can come up with our own algorithms then to study, for example, digital activism, or as many of us do here, also try to understand algorithms using algorithms, essentially. So developing computational social science methods that leverage the possibilities of algorithms, of automatization of certain research practices to study, for example, as we have done in Amsterdam, the impact of personalization algorithms on, for example, voting behavior.
Eugenia, do you want to add to that? The new stakes that algorithms pose for digital activism specifically?
Just following Stefania's kind of like trail of thought here, I would say that for me it would be very interesting to think counterfactually in terms of if social movements, progressive social movements, to clarify, were able to build algorithms, what algorithms would they build to serve democracy? And I don't know, I think this is a collective kind of job and a political job. I don't have an answer to this, obviously, but I think it might help us to think counterfactually. Would we want to create algorithms? If so, what these algorithms could include, what we would purposefully move to exclude, and how would we structure these algorithms for the betterment of like democracy and society?
Yeah, well, connecting to what Eugenia was saying, that's a great reflection. Like, would we build them? I mean, yesterday I tried to show in my talk that they're important for visibility and narrative capacity and narrative agency of social movement. There's an ambivalence in that, as Stefania was saying, of course. They add to the repertoire, but at the same time, if we ask, is another type of algorithm possible? Like, or should we abolish them as a possibility? Like that maybe we're playing in a kind of field where we shouldn't even be playing. So I think ambivalence is the word again, the technological ambivalence. I think that algorithm made it even more explicit than it was already, before. Yeah.
From the perspective of capacity to work, individual capacity. My colleagues and I have been doing something about not only about algorithm, but how basically because of political divide of all these people. Some of them got funding from Facebook because corporate responsibility. There's another side that I think Activism somehow push forward this kind of tech company to do something. So there are several things that we've been doing. One is about interventions, about experiment, how to, for example, political divided view all this group of people in terms of different kind of social policy, from same-sex marriage, from political representation, from housing and all this, see whether or not, because there have been tons of psychological study actually in a democratic context in the US mostly, that saying that most of people, because they are divided, was because the algorithm, but also because they don't really understand the issue. Okay, so they have a mechanical understanding of the issue. So if you do more interventions, the finding, which actually 10 years ago was that it's going to work. But then we try to replicate this kind of study in a post-movement context in East and Southeast Asia. Well, that go back to some things that we discussed, is still, the more you explain for most of the issue, political, economic, actually they have become more polarized. They stick back to their own view, except for some cultural issue. Then there'll be some more moderation. So I think those things are I think from, especially there's so many PhD students and fellows here, I think that could push forward our agenda about what kind of new methodology from experiment, field survey, from some panel survey on Twitter that some of my colleagues have been doing. So you only look at the preferences, but you really recruit those people and then look at their behavior. Some know that they are being watched, some don't know, and see what would really happen.
That's fascinating. So when we think about the profound changes that have been brought about by the digital revolution, and we precisely think about this moment where we are right now, how has this been a game changer for activism? And maybe each of you could give me one aspect that has profoundly changed for activism and an example as an answer, so we can end up with a collective answer. What would you say is sort of the real game changer? I mean, just to give you the, to give people context, we thought so many things, right? When the digital revolution came along, that we were going to be so much more participatory. It lowers the cost, it lowers the barriers of participation, it facilitates, time and space compression and asynchronous communication and organizing. But in reality, we've noticed that, many other things obviously have happened since those early predictions of the impact. So when we think about these changes, what do you think has really been the game changer for activism in terms of digital, or a game changer anyway?
I don't know how to answer this, so I will evade the question and say that I don't know that I can say that there has been a single thing that has been a game changer, precisely because like the rise of digital media signal a shift within capitalist modes of production. So I think that has been the main shift, and then activism has had to adapt to this new model of capitalist organization. So at a time like, I grew up in the 80s and 90s, especially in the 90s, that was like just after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the complete victory of liberalism and neoliberalism. So there was no opportunity for any type of activism until the early 2000s in the anti-globalization movement. But the type of activism of the time was still going through basically destroyed trade unions. And with digital media, we found a way to kind of like organize outside trade unions, but this was not necessarily a symptom of digital media. It was that digital media and this were a symptom of shifts within capitalism. So I don't know that I can say that it was one thing, but also that we see everything working in kind of like conjunction with each other. I don't know how helpful this is.
Yeah, and there's probably many ways of answering these questions. That's why you're asking all of us to contribute one. And then I'm thinking, which one do I pick? Well, I decided to go with an old hobby horse of mine, which is the issue of collective identity. And for me, what I've, assuming the collective identity, the identification, the recognition, right, of the existence of a collective we that stands in for also what I am and all of that, therefore connected to group making and claim making. But what you are noticing, in particular with the advent of social media platforms, is a move from collective identity, old style, and sorry, I'm not even venturing into a literature review here, but you probably know what I mean. And that's be substituted by a sort of politics of visibility, which is also something that Emiliano was talking about yesterday. So almost like if, and I'm oversimplifying here, but that to like the identity, so making visible that you are there somewhere became a placeholder for identity with a number of consequences. And just leave it at that.
Good question. I'll say one thing that, for example, in the realm of algorithmic activism, as we have seen, is the fact that because algorithms are pervasive, are omnipresent, resistant to them is also omnipresent. Like, whereas there are, of course, groups that are more oriented to more of tech-savvy activists, etc., that of course persist. And there are also, I think it's becoming more mundane and more ordinary than it was before. It's about a lot of people that are, I don't know, like gig workers, the influencing industry, but it really permeates a lot of people, but also people that didn't care about these things, but now they're affected because, they have to send a kid to school, and all of a sudden it's an algorithm deciding who's on top of the list, who's not, and you want to have an awareness of what is going on. And so sometimes there is a continuum, of course, of things that you can do to try to understand that, but it makes many of us a bit more activist in that. I don't think there's a technology that is going to change. I think that's a narrative that is being pushed a lot by especially tech mega. It's really a wired kind of narrative, but what we're seeing on the ground is more this kind of mundanity, this spread to all different sphere of people that have to deal with this, because visibility again is structured along this line, because many things are now filtered through these algorithms. Awareness of this and then intervention on this becomes widespread in a way. That not the same level of awareness, of course, not the same level of intervention, but it does trickle down. There is more and more awareness, and it makes us more engaging with this, even not just traditional kind of groups that dealt with technology or digital rights. And I think that's a great thing. It's just it should be even more.
Just follow up with the groups and community things, and maybe posing some questions instead of directing having some answers. I was thinking about, we talk about influences or micro influences, and that is part of the activism, right? I mean, people try to talk to people closer with like-minded individuals or groups, exercising their capacity and also their technological capabilities. And of course, we know actually some groups of people are more capable than the others. Okay, it could be the generational divide, could be because some exercise more, having more social capitals or political networks than the others, and sponsorships. I think those are really certain kind of room that we could further push forward the agenda research and look at whether or not which groups are going to be more important at which point of the time, and of course in what kind of society. Because for me, at least this is the interaction that compared with the traditional media system. I mean, we have celebrities, we have all these anchors who have been with us for decades. But the influencer in the social media age, I mean, the more, those algorithms, those on the top, they tend to fluctuate. But the micro one, I don't know. I don't have research. I don't know. So how these two groups also work together, the back end and all this kind of thing, I think we'll probably go back to some of the techniques we suggest. It is not only about, can be some sort of ethnography that we have to do. Yeah.
Yeah, that I'll answer as well because I think one of the big changes that I noticed, I mean, obviously we already had digital technologies in the late 1990s and the early 2000s, but one of the big differences that I noticed was the availability of Wi-Fi when it started becoming so cheap and so available that even squats had it, whereas in the late 90s we didn't. So there was a real time and space separation between the assembly, and there was also a real privacy to the assembly. And once we had Wi-Fi and smartphones and were able to connect with our computers and our emails during the assembly, then it became a much more hybrid space, and you could in real time contact people who before you would have gone home, then you would have gotten in touch with them, or you would have called them, or you would have written them an email. But now it's like, okay, so ask him, blah, 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 blah. And that might seem a minor thing, but it's actually quite a fundamental transformation in the way that organization actually happens. And the other difference is the lack of that boundary of privacy, right? Front stage, backstage. Because one of the sort of digital democratic imaginaries is that everything should be public and everything should be transparent. But of course, a lot of organizing is about really hard conversations among trusted people, right? It's not about, you're not ready to kind of go public with that. You're still figuring things out. You're talking about who you're going to get in touch with and all this kind of thing. And so for a while there, what people were doing was they were streaming the assemblies so anybody could join in a hybrid way. But what does that do to the dynamic in the assembly, right? Then there becomes an element of performativity, right? Because you are in some sense performing for an audience that you cannot see and who you don't know who's there. And then it also has implications for infiltration. Now, of course, we all know that you can become infiltrated by police working undercover, and this may go on for years and you don't know it. But it's less likely, right, if you know and trust your fellow assembly people, that that's going to be the case. Whereas, of course, if you open up online, basically, you're just being listened to 24/7, right? So I think those kind of shifts really are only visible when you do ethnography, as Edmund said, when we don't try to understand the digital from the digital, but try to understand the digital from the practice and groundedness of activist practices and how they intersect with that, and then with a wider media ecology. So I guess that would be what I would throw into the mix there. Stefania, you really like this term, and I think it's a cool one. You like this term, contentious data. We're doing this special issue on contentious data, and I just wanted you maybe to say a couple things about why this term and what do you mean by it. So maybe we add, since that's the first thing we used on this event, you can give us an answer about what that is exactly.
Yeah, thank you so much for this question. First of all, I have to credit actually my co-author and then postdoc Davide Beraldo for having coined the title Contentious Data, because in fact, we organized an event with this title, only Contentious Data, nothing else, in 2016 in Amsterdam. And it was the kickoff of the Data Active project back then, which was concerned about studying digital activism. And we were already using the notion of contentious politics of data. So the idea that, well, I can tell you more about that, but he came up with, we were looking for a cool poster, essentially. And they came up with that. And he's actually very good at that. If you ever need a cool title, ask Davide, really. It might not be random that actually he studied branding and social movement. So, it might have been, influenced by the activists that he was studying. In any case, so where does contentious data come from? Well, coming from social movement, studied both me and myself and Davide, we've been reading extensively about the notion of contentious politics, which, now butchering really the literature, but for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to just say it's, a concept that is broader than the notion of social movements, and refers to a number of ways of making claims of political nature. And then, we were trying to make sense of what we knew of that literature in relation to a society which was a datafied society, or increasingly so. So that's where the contentious politics of data comes from. Then the contentious data is almost like a contraption of the notion of contentious politics. What does it mean in a nutshell? It means that data are non-neutral, cannot be taken at face value, but especially they're also a tool for social change. But at the same time, they're also an object of contention of their own right. So and it reflects the fact that at some point, about 10 years ago, a bit more, also citizens started, or people, right, started being concerned about surveillance, or all the mechanisms related to personalization, social media, and you name it. So that's what we were hinting at.
Before I was talking about sort of the early days of positive optimism, cyber optimism, right, as it's been called. And of course, you know, this idea that everything's going to be more open, more democratic, more egalitarian. And, you know, then we started realizing a few things, right? I mean, as the broad sort of world, which is that it wasn't just an issue of the fact that we recognized structural inequalities like the digital divide, which of course was an early sort of understanding. Hey, actually, not everybody's connected to the internet. You know, hey, actually, everybody doesn't have access to this technology. In fact, billions of people don't. But I think if we move even beyond that, we've then also, I think, become much more nuanced and sophisticated in our understanding of the ways that the digital public sphere, if you want to call it that, has people who are actively working to exclude, to silence, to target, especially women, LGBTQ, people of darker complexions, or people of different faiths, and so on. So just what should we understand about the way this actually works in the online public sphere, and what, if anything, can we do about it? Obviously, that's a huge question, but I just mean, like, if you just have one sort of take on it, and I will ask Eugenia because she's done a lot of work on this, a very fascinating work, by the way. So please look it up if you're interested in this. I'll hand over.
Thanks, Christina. So the question is, what can we do to address like exclusion and marginalization of people from the digital public sphere?
And kind of also how does that actually work? Because people have this idea that, you know, you go online and you get to talk and everybody gets to talk.
And
So
no
what
one knows
happens?
that you're a dog. Okay, yeah. I don't know that we can address the continued exclusion of certain groups that are marginalized and also made vulnerable online without addressing what is happening outside the online environment. And I think that that these two directly speak to each other, and they have to be addressed together. I find very interesting and very fascinating and very important perspectives like data feminism that are trying to use data to prove and support what we have known already. But when it's there with incontrovertible evidence couched in the language of data and empiricism, that is something that you can confront policymakers with, and make your argument a lot more forceful, then perhaps this is something that we could do. We could use the same tools that have been traditionally used in the context of subjugating and extracting from others, to use them in order to redress some of the harm that they have caused.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point. And we know that people's minds aren't changed by rational arguments, science, or data alone, but that doesn't mean that they're not incredibly important. And I think a lot of times with the relativism that we see today, and the polarization, there is a way to say, actually, look at the data. You know, like, you don't believe me, that's fine, but the data says otherwise, right? The data says this and that about, you know, misogynistic hate speech, or about gender inequality, or about the gender pay gap. And we have, I guess, more capacity than ever before to actually collect and analyze that data, again, thanks to the datafied society that we're living in, right? Stefania, did you want to add it? No problem. Emiliano or Edmund? The question, to refresh your memory, is to say something, about the exclusion and
I would just add, I mean, from a genius from apart from the scientific evidence, is also about, I totally agree with that. I just want to add on who present those evidence. That is, I think, in the communications and digital age, that is really important. I mean, what kind of knowledge communities, right? And I mean, COVID, we know, I mean, well, it's just too complicated and fragmented. Whether or not, I mean, when scientists present their data, I know, I mean, in some cases, in some society, they still consider as trustworthy. Okay, so they really able to put forward something about vaccination, wearing masks, and why are those important. But in other society, more conspiracy, skepticism. I mean, I've been running through for this cross-national survey for several wave in US, UK, and also in East Asia. Well, that's really fragment. I would say, I mean, a lot of people believe that all the vaccines are going to transform our DNA, and all these conspiracy actually are quite serious. And of course, when we break down into geolocal, the red and blue in US has significant difference. So I think those are, but at least what we see is that what kind of information, if they access this kind of information, tradition and frequency really matters. And what kind of people they tend to, in terms of the neighborhood, they trust which group of neighbor, or trust a scientist will also matter. So I think those are still the new mechanism to be developed, so that we can how to see how is the better way to convene this kind of more scientific evidence and messages.
Mm-hmm.
Connecting to what Eugenia was saying, I think we need to do better at showing the good uses of data. I had a student coming out to me like, it's really apocalyptic. I teach a model called Datafied Society on all of these topics, and so like, yeah, why don't we dedicate a session to explain good uses of data, positive uses of data, emancipatory uses of data, transformative. And I was like, yeah, you're completely right. Let's do a really, vibrant, hopeful, beautiful session where we show how it's been used by communities at the margins, in politics, in culture, in whatever kind of, in so many ways. I think there are examples, but we need to do more to show also the things that have been done, and these will disclose also ways that we can use them ourselves in the future. But at the level of education, we need to do more also showing this, because sometimes we evoke it, but we're not as good as showing, look, this is a way that it could go the other way. So we have Black Mirror, but then on the other side we have a white mirror of also of things that are actually with a repertoire of great practices, things that went well, things that could have gone wrong but didn't because of this and this factor, because of this circumstance. And I think that motivates. That doesn't, it changes together with other things, but I think it's a good way. I try to insert it more within my own practices, because otherwise I tend to go a bit, well, it's completely understandable given the circumstances, and we tend to go a bit on the dark side, like explaining, look, the situation is really like that. But in order to keep it up, but also to refresh, to give a bit, I think we need to show it and to find them, and only find them because sometimes they're buried, and they're not always, talking about data feminism. They also have the stuff on data feminicide and Mexico, and the way they display that to do justice to the victims and all of that. And data in that case, if I have to use a case of that, it's been used incredibly by citizen and by civil society. In that case, that is something that I would say, okay, let's talk about this. Let's talk about how it can make a difference, in subjectivities, in politics, in policy, etc., etc.
Yeah, in my teaching in power politics and participation in the digital age, I also do a module on from something from The Guardian that they did a long time ago, which is a discussion with the journalists there, some women of color, and another male journalist of color, talking about their experiences as public figures in journalism and what they are exposed to, and the kind of hatred and vitriol. And then we go into a section that they have on moderation, and then discussing with the students, like, how would you moderate this content? Do you consider this content, Would you flag it as misogynist? Would you not? And just getting sort of people to be aware of what happens to, especially also women in positions of authority or women who are speaking out online is just incredible. The feminist ministers, for example, the amount of hatred and concerted campaigns of disinformation, mashup videos where they take one sentence that they say and they delete all the rest of it to make it seem that they said something really outrageous when they never said any such thing. It's a constant barrage. And I don't even know how they can resist being in politics. You know, I mean, I think they're so brave to even put their head above the parapet because they're just getting shot at from every possible angle. But I don't know kind of what more we can do about it. So I guess that's where I was going with the question. But Stefania, have you had a chance to think? Do you want to say anything more about it? Or are you still thinking and you want to go on to...
So what can we do about it? You know, I always have, so there was a reference earlier to libertarianism and stuff like that. And I hate to admit that, but sometimes I do find myself to be a little bit of a cyber libertarianist. And one of the things that I really like to remind ourselves of is that ultimately, beyond the policing and the punishment, that so the cleaning up or forbidding certain you know, expressions of freedom of expression that should not belong in a democratic discourse because they are offensive, because they are violent, because they're fascist, and you name it, whether we have legislation or not that can empower that to do so. But ultimately, what really is the game changer is, at least for some part of the problem, is literacy. Is, you know, knowing, I mean, it doesn't solve the problem of being offended or being the target of a hatred campaign. But it does at least put into perspective or makes apparent the mechanisms through which this comes into being. And, you know, you're never going to hear me say things like, well, let's get rid of anonymity, for example, or let's make sure that to make a comment online, I have to show my passport beforehand. Because this, I mean, there are many people that do not, I mean, it would punish maybe or work as a deterrent against certain, you know, mean people, so to say, but it would also disempower many others who, for example, don't have the so-called undocumented migrants, for example. They're still part of a polity, but they would not be comfortable enough to speak
or
up.
Dissidents.
Dissidents, exactly. I mean, in a democratic or non-democratic countries, even worse. So I'm never going to go down that argument, that road of the getting rid of anonymity. But literacy, I think, could solve part of the problem. Not, you know, not the violence, not still being on the receiving end of all of that.
You mean media literacy?
Digital and data
Digital
literacy. Yeah, I mean, basically the updated version of what we used to call media literacy, which should be part really of, and this is something that I keep repeating all the time. I'm sorry if it's boring. You probably have heard me make this argument several times already, but I do believe that it should be embedded in the school curriculum from age, you know, from day one of primary school.
And since it isn't, that's why I do a little bit of it in my own teaching, even though I'm not by no means an expert in it, but I at least try to bring that into the classroom. I wanted to I just have a couple other questions I thought we could discuss. Jennifer Earl and Maher and Pan have an article in Science Advances, which is a review of the literature on what they call digital repression. And they define digital repression of social movements, protest, and as actions directed at a target to raise the target's costs for digital social movement activity and or the use of digital or social media to raise the cost for social movement activity wherever that takes place. Okay, so it's either targeting. And this is everything from persecution of individuals online for speaking out or for tweeting or for organizing. It could be using digital tools to perform repressive actions like your smart lampposts, right? You know, the smart lampposts in Hong Kong. It could be the development and deployment of information strategies that are designed to diminish protest. And that can range from online harassment to regime violence. It could be online disinformation campaigns to discredit certain, mobilizations, digital social credit, and things like that. So I thought, do you guys want to share some examples of how this digital repression is operating today in the different contexts that you study, and what, if anything, can be done about them?
Like use your previous kind of point on misogyny and say how this in fact acts like a repression mechanism, because there are massive chilling effects against women in particular, and certainly against anti-racist activists as well. So also this, we had a brief discussion about this yesterday, but the way in which cancel culture is weaponized, that also has massive chilling effects. And I don't really necessarily see it as a force for good, even if its roots are in restorative justice and attempts to hold people accountable. So so these are just two mechanisms, perhaps, misogyny, racism, and weaponized cancel culture.
To look at a specific angle of digital repression, and this is not my means a way of justifying it, but also like to reflect on what social movements of activists themselves do to be exposed to digital repression. Again, this is not a way of putting responsibility onto them, but I remember, so let's say, I already mentioned it yesterday, I think there is a contradiction on certain forms of activism, certain value sets that activists stand for, and what change they would like to see in the world, and the platforms they use for mobilization. And I understand, of course, that's where people hang out, you have to be there, and so on and so forth. But I also remember very vividly, I called this circulating, I believe in 2012. It was called "We Need to Talk About Facebook." It was a very, quick and dry, if you want, a matter of fact, depiction and a summary of why we should actually not use Facebook. I mean, now you can substitute Facebook with TikTok, Instagram, whatever other platform you want to use. It was authored by one of the operators, the groups operating an alternative server in Germany. It's quickly translated in many languages, and basically what it tried to say is like, hey guys, don't you realize that we are, by being so active and using these things, these platforms also to organize, we are going to basically we serve to the people that want to repress us. We serve way too many information. They don't even have to do the intelligence, right? Mm-hmm. And that's why there is something called open source intelligence, after all, that is used very much in this digital repression type of strategies. So once again, it's not a way of justifying the fact that digital repression happens, but it's also a way of reflecting into the necessity of forms of self-protection by the movements themselves, and maybe the necessity of a tiered strategy when it comes to engaging in certain platforms versus others. Mm-hmm. So organizing maybe happens offline. Organizing maybe happens in a secure mailing list and not, or should, like, maybe I still want to be on TikTok with a little dance to show people why it's so cool to come to my demo, but so that's just something to keep into account. Sorry for hijacking the question. But,
no, I think that's
something that again, old hobby horse of mine, because it really bothers me.
Yeah, the problem I think for a lot of people, just to insert something there, is that, so for example, in the 15M movement, the infrastructure, the digital infrastructure of the movement was Titan pads, right? Titan pads, Ether pads, and everybody used them. There was a huge, massive sort of archive. They could be encrypted, they could be private, they could be public, however you wanted to set it up. But the problem was that then nobody was updating the code. And so the code started deteriorating, and there just wasn't enough people who were interested in keeping that going. And it just stopped. We got an email, everybody who's ever been on it got an email saying, look, we can't maintain this. And I think that's the disadvantage that, we always say, well, activists should create their own, infrastructure and organizing and software and this and that and the other. Of course they do. But then, of course, the problem that you encounter is that people don't know how to use it. People don't know how to find it. They don't know how to install it, and they're not there. So activists then, I think, migrated to where people are because they want to find the people, they want to recruit the people, they want to communicate with the people. So I think there's this real tension, right, between that, without at all disagreeing with you. We're absolutely, and also there's this whole generational, maybe, or just, I don't know, but it's quite shocking to me how many of my students don't care that their data is being extracted by Facebook, right? They're like, oh, not that they're probably on Facebook anymore, they're on something else. But when you ask that question, they're like, yeah, I know, but I don't care because I want to talk to my friends. And to be fair, so do I. I'm still on Facebook, right? Even though I have huge problems with it. Emiliano, you want to pitch in on the digital repression side? We got a little bit off the digital repression angle, but
I like
we'll go back to that.
Yesterday I talked a bit how there are, it takes many forms, right? Many forms, digital repression, and I saw many things. I saw the insertion of noise and pollution, of violence, violent images, violent content, just to drown all the narrative, as I was saying yesterday. So it's a continuum of practices, really. It's relentless, and it's done as the modus operandi of contemporary politics. It is what it is. It's just, I don't think it's something extraordinary. I think it's something that, they have a repertoire of things that they can do, especially on corporate platforms. But I also like to say, and that's my point, that digital repression is also repression, meaning that it can escalate offline easily in many, above all, semi-authoritarian and authoritarian countries. And so we see that these kind of threats, not to spread or limit your activist kind of disobedient practices, can easily escalate into threats at your door, at your car, with your friends, and that happened, and is one of the reasons why I basically stopped to research. The first project that I had in Mexico was on the movement for justice with dignity and peace against the narco trafficking industry, and I didn't know how tough it could be to research something like that. Then I switched to Yo Soy 72, which is a student movement, a different beast. I mean, there were problems of that, infiltration from secret services and stuff, but it was more manageable. It wasn't a difficult movement as such. But the other one is a movement where activists were targeted repeatedly, both online and offline. And sometimes, it's a kind of hybrid kind of repression. I just threaten you online. This escalates online. I just said, and if you don't stop, it's gonna come to that. So sometimes it's not just inserting noise so that your narrative is not spread, which is, sort of, it's an issue, I guess, but it can be really an issue that can have physical consequences and can get people died. And look at the situation of journalists in some countries. I mean, Mexico, one of the most dangerous country for activists and for journalist activists, and look at what can happen. So sometimes it's not just a question of the digital, but it's really, your life is on the line. And when your life is on the line, well, sometimes, you know how it is. So I would like to really stress that repression can, because sometimes saying digital repression can take a bit more,
but the focus away
exactly
of repression. Yeah,
while
absolutely.
I think it's repression, and it's also digital, but it's hard, especially with some kind of movement and with some kind of activists. So it's something that we should take.
Just follow up. It is not digital, but can be relational, because they're left. I mean, the digital world left so many traces of social network, right? And those are people you care, and that of course make your actions more vulnerable. And when they are not targeting a particular activities, but the friends or family. And I mean, O'Brien has taught. I mean, Kenneth O'Brien has written this for quite some time, and for different contexts. And I think I would just add to, at the same time, because I have a co-author who she did something, try to make dialogue with Jennifer Pan. And she seems to suggest there are also limit in a way. I mean, just we're probably going to finish this So I just add something seemingly positive or optimistic. Yeah. To it. Her findings seem to suggest that a limit in the sense that when you continue to censor all these kind of keywords, when the grievances, I mean, somehow these kind of things are signal to governance, no matter you're liberal, democratic, authoritarian, hybrid, right? But when you get rid of all these kind of signal, actually the polity or regime actually become more difficult to manage the society. And people also find new way to communicate. It's just that all these kind of no longer visible. So I think these are also questions, or at least we see some rooms or new development. And I think her papers just got out and out, so I will not review her name, but at least I can talk because so that's the thing. I think that we know there's room, okay, lead to some more optimistic forecasts and know the mechanisms and the limit of that.
Well, I was going to kind of wrap us up with an optimistic thing, but before I do that, I wanted to know if any of you have questions for each other or for all of us, or if you have a question, because I just came up with these random questions. Not random, of course, but you know what I mean? So if anybody, do you guys have anything you want to ask each other, or you're...
So one of the sort of $1 million questions, but I'd like to know, I would like to, know what you think is not being studied that should deserve our attention. Whether you have the ability, the time, the energy to do it, the expertise, even or not, that's another matter. But like, what should we study as, people concerned with the intersection between activism, political participation, and the digital? Small question.
I haven't actually, because I wrote this down yesterday when I was listening to you, actually. And I think one of the things that I've always been interested in, and I've kind of tried to push, especially to people who are doing data, media, et cetera, the whole big field, is, and also, so it's not just a scholarly thing, it's also a political thing, because I think we're lost if we don't understand it, and that is human psychology. So how do people actually respond to the things that we're studying? What are the emotional impacts of them? How do they affect participation or lack of participation? How do they exclude? How do people navigate? How do they understand the choices that they make in terms of their digital consumption, and especially within a context of activism, choosing the tools that they choose? And I think that is a whole area of research that really it's usually there you see so much instrumental stuff, like this affordance, that affordance, this platform does this. And I think that's actually really important. And I think it has really, interesting implications. What happens when you're on, one kind of platform versus another, and how does that facilitate or not certain dynamics and certain outcomes? But I think really connecting and understanding human psychology. And in terms of the political implications of that, I think, the right really understands that. I mean, I think they understand the role of emotions and how narrative and emotions gets people riled up and gets them to act and vote in particular ways. I think the left, or to call it the left or so-called left, progressive, whatever you want to call it, I think they're still really stuck in this idea that if you just give a good argument and give people the information, which again, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. I think that has to be our sort of starting point, right? We're not going to just make stuff up, but that's not enough, right? And I think that so much ground lost because there's a lack of understanding of political communication strategies, and of kind of drawing on that expertise and knowledge from media people, from political communication experts, from people who study human psychology to really understand how this all works and impacts on actual people. So that would be my sort of black spot that I think needs to be thingy. Do you want to?
With you in terms of this, though, my experience of some left kind of like groups is that they do make use of emotion. So it's not all, it's also how this emotion resonates more broadly. But besides this, I want to say something, but I think it's been kind of like studied, but just to highlight its importance, I suppose, which is the resistance movements that are built by workers themselves, both like gig workers that are organizing, and we have like a lot of movement in a new variety of trade unionism among gig workers. Also to a lesser extent, but I'm thinking it's going to become bigger. People working for platforms are pushing back and trying to kind of organize as well. I think now that there have been so many layoffs by tech companies in the last kind of year or so, I think we'll see these highly skilled workers coming together to, if not unionize, because still for a lot of people, especially Americans, and especially these like high level cognitive workers, unionism is like a swear word, but still kind of like coming together and for some collective type of action. And this is a different type of movement to what we've seen so far. It's both kind of like harks back to the history of trade unionism and the labor movement, but also introduces new kind of connections.
That has not been talked about these 2 days, but it is of course being addressed, but maybe not so much as it should. It's the environmental implication of data. So, and for me, it's a question of there's no activism if there is no word. It's just it's as simple as that. And I see that as the most important thing that there is now. So a lot of the stuff that we do, we have talked about seeing data as material. Of course, there's been a lot and embodied, many of us, kind of touched upon that. But at the same time, it's really more material also, that data centers and stuff. I mean, Eugene is coming from Ireland, which is one of the places that where these kind of also contestation have been taking place. And then we have the Netherlands, places also that for a variety of reasons, but other places in Asia or in Latin America where I follow a bit these kind of things, where for a kind of amalgamation of both local politics and climate situation, they are chosen to host these data centers that are some of the most polluting infrastructure that there are around, and data mining takes an incredible amount of resources, especially of water, from community, from people. So I guess the big question that this leads to is, at a certain point, is that do we need this? Because it's a question that do we need to do this scale the technological process that we have in order for us to actually survive in the way, and we know that we need to. It's not just a question of there's so much techno-solutionism in that, and instead we see that more and more we are creating a problem also with electric cars, right? It's great, they don't pollute, but to produce them, an enormous amount of resources. So it seems that there is a big issue there, and I think that probably that without researching that, there is no future research at all. So I think that the environmental question is central also for data and digitalizing, etc., for a lot of things. Yeah.
Advancement, or go back to a lot of things we discussed, whether or not we are seeing some sort of structural transformation or not, and what are the intended or unintended consequences. I mean, because I'm having my sabbatical this year and traveling from Australia, Southeast Asia, and then to Europe, and then now to Denmark. I think I see a lot of changes in all this society because of COVID, which I believe that COVID somehow speed up the use of AI and this kind of, and the impact on the workforce. I mean, I'm from Hong Kong. I suppose it is one of the most developed economy in the world, but then I see actually more technological transformation in Southeast Asia. It's because their economy are really hit hard by this, and then they, go into the small shops. They just have to scan. There are no waiters showing you. I think this kind of thing, and you go to the gym or just keep you the Coke, and there are no people serving. So I think this is a huge impact on the workforce, and those are things that really need to be studied. And this very unevenly distributed in different society and different regions. And I think those are things that really worth more attention and study. And especially we in the middle of this kind of critical point. Yeah, because Hong Kong we have some we actually don't have lockdown. So it's in a way, it has not changed our society. I mean, we still have so many these kind of people. I was just wondering, so it's not completely economically driven, but it also some sort of critical event that speed up the use of AI and this kind of thing. So I think the comparative angle and this impact can be further studied as a research agenda. Yeah.
The techno solutionism, I'm not laughing at it, but I mean, it made me think of a kind of funny story because when I was doing my ethnography in 15M, I knew this hacker collective, and I ran into one of the hackers one day, and we were having a nice chat, and he said, "Yeah, I'm feeling really good," and I said, "Yeah, what's up?" And he goes, "Oh, we just had such a great meeting. Our collective just had this great meeting. We're just feeling really inspired. We have this new idea." And I said, "Well, what is it?" And I was expecting to hear some really like technologically sophisticated like campaign or whatever. He's like, "Yeah, we talked a lot, or we thought about it a lot, and we decided that the best thing that we can do is talk to the neighbors." And I was like, "You got it. You got it." It all starts with the community, and it starts with where you are. So it's good to maybe remember that human to human connection, right? Because when everything goes to hell, we'll probably need to rely on each other, and data isn't going to help us in that, right? Yeah. So I think we're all tired and ready to wrap up, and also hopefully inspired. My last question was just maybe to end on a more positive note. What hope or opportunities, strategies, or tactics should or could progressive activists kind of use or think about today? And I think we were talking before about what was it when we were talking about with Emiliano about the different strategies that he was talking about in the algorithmic repertoire. We were saying that maybe, teaching other activists about these strategies and how to use them would be one pedagogical kind of collective response to the current kind of world we're living in. But does anybody want to have any other hopeful or optimistic things they want to end on?
I think that the young generation don't need a bunch of boomers telling them. But no, seriously, I think that there is a tendency to kind of like throw the baby out with the bathwater with this kind of like critiques. My view is that a lot of these technologies have been developed because of like our labor, both in terms of data providers and in terms of like ourselves, our sons, our cousins, our husbands working in like software development or in adjacent kind of like they are produced by labor. So just like dismissing them because corporations and states are using them, I don't think it's a good idea. Reappropriating them critically, I think that's something I want to see done. Getting control over them, that's something that I also think that that is a kind of like part of the arsenal here of tactics.
Well, I guess what I feel personally the need of is of narratives of empowerment and narratives of also of optimism and hope. Because especially after COVID, I think as a society, we're just, very tired of this gloomy prospects and doomsday type of narratives. And if there's any, change has to come also through, galvanizing the very same idea of change. And, I'm also thinking about going back to very certain basic notions, yet very elaborated notions of empowerment, from Freire, for example, Paulo Freire, and the pedagogy of all of this. So because probably change comes, I mean, it's a very generic idea. It's not very a recipe for nothing really. But also if you think about, I think, for example, the Italian left, and how it comes across as litigious and mostly emphasizes what's wrong, and again the value or the normative discourse which works with certain sectors of the population, but feels also like a huge responsibility for others in a situation in which actually others instead do what the exercise of blaming some random pedophiles for the problems of the world, which is very liberating, because then it becomes not my responsibility anymore, right? So very generic recipe, but personally I feel I need a little bit more of that to get going, and therefore I also guess that it could maybe help social movements as well.
We have a lot of work to do. I think as scholars, we need to, of course, to do more. I realize how difficult it is to translate, this concept. What are you talking exactly when you're talking about the datafied society? What is that? So we spent almost 2 years with a website explaining this stuff with the lab. It's called Datafied Society, democratizing the datafied society, and we collaborated with people from the visual people that did the data for Black Lives, and in order to translate visually what it means, it's an incredible effort. But then you have these sketches, these visual and stuff that are really able to, arrive where they had to get, where they had to get to people who are not familiarized with this kind of jargon or conceptual vocabulary. And that, for me, this translation work in a way, also with multilingualism with Stefan, we have been working so much with trying to to spread this in so many languages, in languages that we don't know, and in trying to provoke some discomfort in people to recognize that there is always some kind of discomfort in learning something, in not understanding something that is not in the lingua franca of English. So multiplying that and making the effort not just to speak, to preach to the converted or to publish another article, which is great, career is great, your colleagues will read it, but also to use other forms of dissemination, other forms of public intervention, and doing the effort of really translating that into, because if you're not able to say it in simple words, you don't understand it. And you cannot explain it, and people will not get it, and then such is the chain of events. So I think that's a really an important job to do.
On my left hand side, I mean the narrative, the way they construct the story, I think especially this is really important for the new generation of scholars. I mean, just think of your comparative advantage. Yes, maybe for your whole generation, you're good at a lot of new methods. Okay, you know how to take data, but because the whole generation of scholars are also good at that. I mean, what will make you unique can stand out, and we to make contribution to scholarships and also among your peers would be how you really think of the vocabulary, the narrative that you can construct a good story based on, of course, a very good sets of data and method. But I think those will be still very important things. And that's also, I think, what we will somehow benefit from these 2 days of workshops. Yeah, that's.
Another little anecdote from the 15M movement that I learned. One of my favorite groups is called 15M Barato. And when I was interviewing them and talking about what they did, they actually exposed some of the biggest corruption cases in Spain in the last years. And they are a catalyst group of digital activists, and they work with whistleblowing and a combination of different tactics. But what they really want to do, I mean, they do all these incredible things, right? And they set very concrete and specific goals for their project, and then they meet them, which is amazing. But they see what their sort of meta goal is to transmit the idea that citizens can do it if they work together. And that's what movements need to do. That's what progressive scholars need to do. We need to find ways to transmit the stories and to tell the stories and to celebrate the victories, even in really dim and grim times, to say that actually things can be done. And here's some examples of how they're done and so on. So I think this is just following up on Stefania's point of the power of empowering narratives as a key tool that we need to use. And it's not enough. And this is kind of, I've been preparing a talk that I have to give soon in Manchester. But I was thinking, thinking about all the different groups that I study, it's not enough to just react. It's not enough just to critique. There has to be innovation. There has to be proactive action. Even though all of those other things are incredibly important. And I don't want to dismiss the importance of that, because countering hegemonic narratives is incredibly difficult and incredibly important. But I think we have to also, we can't just stop there. You can't just say everything is terrible and it's their fault. Do you know what I mean? Like, that's not a very empowering and mobilizing message. So that would be my final thing from the social movement point of view. To wrap this up, I want to thank everybody for sticking with us, and for especially you PhD students who have stuck with us to the end, and people online who have stuck with us. And thanking again Shape for funding the event and the IAS.